God, he demonstrates himself through all of his creation. And one very important source that can help us learn more about how he is other people. You see, we're made in the image of God, and to the extent that a person has become more like him, they can be a demonstration of him. To that end, if you reread it with eyes to see, there are so many scriptures that sound like maybe they're teaching forgiveness or kindness or something else, but one important underlying theme woven throughout these is actually that it sets us up to protect us from unrighteously condemning these people that the Lord sends to help us see a better way than what we would have done anyway. Now, instead of using this, actually what most Christian churches, so-called, do is that they will gather together a whole bunch of people based on what they already believe. If you're in trouble and you're far from God, that's just about the worst thing you can do. You should expect that a functioning, effectual church is going to teach you things that are different than what you believe. It's going to teach you things that maybe you don't want to hear. That's the whole point, right? You have to lose yourself to find something better. So one thing that I've noticed and noticed again and again is that there seems to be this body of people who tend to be inheritors of religion, meaning that the beliefs that they have probably came through their parents, if not further back, who are actually devoid of the honesty, open-mindedness, critical thinking, and courage that whoever their ancestor was had, that was extremely critical in helping them adopt these beliefs that were different than what they already had. And like I said, there's this de-evolution of the power of these churches into the modern day when they just become echo chambers, and anyone that thinks differently, they just boot to the curb. And so it dissolves the power of these examples that God has sent into a window so narrow that the only thing that's allowed through is what the person already believes. And they superimpose this not just on present day examples, if any were to emerge, but mostly I'm actually talking about the scriptures. So they'll reinterpret the scriptures based on these beliefs that they have, and they'll blind themselves to seeing anything else that might be there, to the extent that they will openly criticize holy men from the past who were designated as such by God. They will openly criticize and condemn these people, even when those people have attributes that exceed those of the criticizer. And they recognize this. They'll make the person an offender for a word, or toss them to the side because of something they say that they don't like, or something they did that they think that they would do better in their place. This is really bad. The reason it's bad is because the token and sign that God provides us to help us find people that have something more than what we do, it isn't that everything they bring is already attractive to us. It's that they have something that we claim to believe is valuable, and yet we do not have it. And that link is what demonstrates the possibility, it's not a guarantee, that whatever else they might have might be at least as important as the thing whose value we already recognize. So, as an example of this, when Jesus came, he came doing miracles. He came teaching great wisdom. And in both of these things, he clearly exceeded what anyone alive at that time could do. And in fact, what anyone had ever done. And they openly recognized this. They'd say things like, "We've never known of a man who has healed someone that was born blind. We've never known of anyone who had this kind of wisdom." They'd say things like this. And the people that said that still didn't believe in any of the other things that he did. They found fault in it because it contradicted their traditions. It contradicted what they already believed. They got it backwards. And so they said, well, these positive qualities that he has, surely they must be from the devil. And he had something to say about that. But I have a rule of thumb that I live by, which is that I don't criticize people who are better than me. That's something that you should definitely apply in your own life. Now, what does this mean? It means that these people who have created this fad of criticizing Peter, for example, criticizing Paul even, criticizing Abraham, criticizing David, criticizing Solomon. Now, in some cases, some of these people did things that the Lord himself criticized them for. And rehashing that is an important thing that all of these people would want us to do so that we can stand on their shoulders. If God criticized them, then you can bet that that criticism was well-fitted and that it was designed to help us and them. However, once we start injecting things into this, we need to be super duper careful because the natural man is an enemy to God. And you shouldn't suppose that just because something offends you or is different than what you believe, that means that it's wrong. If it's present in a person who you know is closer to God than you, then you should assume that that is more correct than whatever you would believe in its place. I said assume, and what I mean is just keep an open mind. You shouldn't assume that it's true. I didn't say that. You see, people can be right about some things and not others. Why is this important? Because what we should be doing is not tearing down people that we know are better than us. We should be emulating the parts of them that we recognize as righteous. I said that very carefully. So let's say that you look at Abraham or David or Solomon. You say, oh, a bunch of polygamists, right? Write them off. Can't learn anything from them. Well, God said David had a heart like him. Solomon was the wisest man. And Abraham was a friend of God. Maybe we should just set aside the whole polygamy thing. It's okay. If you don't think that's from God, that's all right. Throw a pin in it. I've got one right here. I didn't stage that, by the way. So, hey, why don't you work on the sacrifice of Abraham? Because you believe that was good, right? Well, why don't you take a couple of steps towards being a friend of God by upping the amount of sacrifice you're willing to make in his behalf, in obedience to him? What about David? Well, I'm sure there are a lot of things you could do to have a heart more like him. And time doesn't suffice to go through the life of David. It's an amazing story. He's an amazing guy. Solomon, I mean, we can all be wiser, right? And how he gained that wisdom is probably just as important. He made this enormous sacrifice. He was given so much wealth from his father, and he used it to make an appropriately large sacrifice to the Lord. And the Lord appeared to him in a dream and said, what do you want? That's a question that we should all be prepared to answer. It's a very important one because you're probably not going to be ready if and when that ever happens, if you haven't thought about it ahead of time. And he said he wanted wisdom so that he could serve the people. And so that's what he was given. And the why was very important. Now, if let's make this secular just to bring it closer to home. So if the richest man in the world popped into your house like a genie, and for whatever reason, he said, look, up to and including my entire fortune, what do you want? What would you ask him and why would you want it? The difference between you and Solomon, you could probably sketch that out in a little more clarity than you have before. And all of that difference, it gives you something to work on. Maybe a whole bunch of somethings, right? But if you just sort of think, well, this person had this one flaw, so far as I'm concerned, and therefore I'm going to completely ignore all of the parts about them that were far more virtuous than I am, well, then you're sort of missing the boat, aren't you? That's not a very honest way to live. And you're really wasting a terrible amount of beneficial example that we've all been given. So we should back off from this willingness to criticize people that we know are more righteous than we are. It's really important because these examples, in many ways, they're like a lifeline that God has given us. You know, he can speak to anybody through the Spirit. But there are all sorts of constraints on that connection, chief of which might be our own disobedience to God. And so if you're living in a life of sin, because you continue to sin, you have not repented of your sins, it's all the more reason to seriously look at the examples of people who are more righteous than you. They'll demonstrate some of the benefits that you're missing out on through not having repented, and they'll also help you understand things more than you can in your present state. Inasmuch as we rebel against God, we seriously impede our ability to think critically, especially on topics that make us feel guilty or scared or any other negative emotion, overwhelmed. And so you have to ask yourself, how is God going to get through to you? The scriptures are a wonderful tool, but when your brain's all gunked up with sin, you are impeding your ability to understand them. And maybe some kid who's never read the scriptures before, if you plopped some chapter in front of his face or in front of her face, they could crank out an exposition on that book that would be so much closer to the intent of the author than you could. And you won't know that. While you're living in sin, it's going to be hard to see. What you'll interpret, if anyone comes along and tries to help you with this, you're just going to feel worse. And because you're living in a downgraded state where everything just turns into raw emotion because you've seriously impeded your critical thinking ability and your reasoning, it's really hard to get through to you. And so these examples, remember when the prophet came to David, when, ironically, now I'm going to teach a principle pointing at something David did that was wrong. When David married Bathsheba and sent her husband off to die before he did that, God sent a prophet to him to chastise him for this. And the way the prophet made it clear to David is he laid out an analogy, a story. And David saw right away that what the person in the story had done was very wrong. In fact, it was worthy of death. David said he didn't know it was a story. He said, let's find this guy. We have to put him to death because it was so wrong. What he did was so wrong. And the prophet said, thou art the man. You see the power of these examples. Well, we have scriptures chock full of these examples. But if you're just willy-nilly writing them off because some part of that person's life is something that you don't agree with, you're really going to miss out on so much. And if you're the kind of person that would write those things off, you're probably also the kind of person that's living in sin. And so it's all the more important for you to take these examples seriously and not be so arbitrary to condemn these people who are clearly more righteous than you are. It's not a good thing. Please don't do it.